Hi everybody, this is Jana from Papercraft Miracles, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the story behind my business and how it came to be. So this is pretty much that. So I always knew that I wanted to make art, but I didn't want to be a starving artist. So I created my own major in college, bringing business and art together. And it was during that time that I learned to make paper and books and came up with the idea for my company. And this is way back in 2001, but it took until 2013 to really make it official. And it was hard to jump right out of college into being a full-time artist, even though I was technically prepared to do that. And the Renaissance in Buffalo wasn't quite happening yet, and I didn't have the social connections to really make it work. And I ended up working as an assistant manager in a gas station for 5 years. And then I worked as a photo editor for an online jewelry company for 5 more years after that, and making and selling art in my free time. And it did at times feel like it would never actually get to the point where I could do what I love full time, but I kept at it anyway because, when you're an artist, you just keep making art. You can't help it. And I thought that I felt like I was wasting my time doing something that wasn't my passion. And I learned a lot about running a business during those 10 years that I wouldn't have learned if I didn't spend them helping to run someone else's business. I learned about management at the gas station, running reports, doing inventory, managing employees, all that stuff. And at the jewelry company, I learned how to take and edit photos to sell products online, and that experience has proved very valuable in creating a successful business for myself. So you never know what you might be learning today that could help you in the future. And I know that my love for creating comes from my mom. She was such a creative person. I mean, everything about her was creative, and my drive to work hard and push myself also comes from her influence. And I remember the first day of kindergarten, they wanted me to color in a dinosaur. And by this point, I was already writing poems and learning cursive. So dino coloring, hella boring. So I came home and I was like, Mama, kindergarten is boring. And I'll never forget her response. She said to me, if you're bored, you're not trying hard enough. And that made me stop right in my tracks. And she followed it up with, do it because you can, not because anyone is going to make you. And this advice stuck with me. And I think about it daily, the things that I can do in this world because I'm able to, not because I'm forced to. And I believe that this one little phrase drives my creative entrepreneurial energy. I don't need a boss telling me what to do. I just tackle what I'm able to do each day because I can. I know it sounds hokey to have that can-do spirit, but I sure as shit do, because you have to create despite the struggles of life. And the most prolific time in my life for learning to create through struggle came when I was a junior in college. I went to this little school called Warren Wilson. It's just outside Asheville, North Carolina. And the year I turned 20 sucked. It was rough. My mom died on Friday the 13th, and then 4 months later, on what should have been her 55th birthday, my dorm burnt to the ground with all my stuff in it. Poof. Toast. Everything. Yeah. Everything. I lost all of my journals for my whole entire life. All my artwork, all my supplies, everything my mom had given me in the last 5 years of her life. And then they cut my financial aid because I couldn't put my mom on the FAFSA anymore. So almost overnight, I went from being a carefree college kid to a totally unprepared adult. I had inherited a house that needed a ton of work that I couldn't afford, and I had a year and a half left of school that I couldn't afford halfway across the country, and I kept thinking, where's the cancer in the bus that's coming to hit me? Because I'm ready, I'm ready. And 3 days after the fire, I was sitting with my roommate, and I just looked at her, and I was like, dude, all of our shit burnt up. And we immediately started laughing, that roll on the ground because life is so fucking absurd kind of laughing. And after that, it was all funny. It had to be funny or I was not going to survive. And the next day, I began to create again. And my whole life, I had kept journals and written poetry and made art to try to capture who I was inside. And when all of it was gone, I suddenly realized I had no idea who I was. And I got to start all over again. And I'd always been afraid of losing my things, and after it actually happened, I saw that it was the most freeing thing to get a chance to create a whole new life for myself from scratch. It was right after that when I really started to focus on creating my business because I knew that life is short, and I didn't want to end up like my mom, who loved to create and never found a way to make a living doing what she loved. And that's why I picked the name Papercraft Miracles, because this business saved me when I literally had nothing. It is and has always been my miracle, the sparkle in the darkness. I create because I can, because I'm able, and not because anyone is going to make me. I somehow managed to continue school and keep my house from falling down, and I graduated on time with a 3.94 GPA. No clue how I did any of that. The whole time was a blur. And after graduation, I had a crappy Angel Fire website and a 12-page photocopied catalog that I made, and I drove back to Buffalo ready to hit the ground running. And I bought a small paper-making kit and a big cutting mat from Michael's Arts and Crafts and set up a table in my attic bedroom and got to work creating some inventory. And I knew the basics of starting a business, but I really wasn't prepared yet. I also still had the house that needed lots of work that I couldn't afford, and I ended up taking the job at the gas station because I really needed steady paychecks and health insurance. And this is pre-Obamacare, when you couldn't buy individual health insurance plans for less than $1,500 a month, and I definitely couldn't afford that. So I started working for $6 an hour. $6 an hour! Making coffee and selling cigarettes and lottery tickets. I worked my crappy job with a smile, all while wearing a button on my uniform that said, "Damn straight I'm a college grad, paper or plastic." And I got promoted quickly, and I got good enough at my job to negotiate a schedule that would allow me to have my evenings free to do poetry readings and play music out around town. And I slowly, little by little, built up my social network here. And the more places I went, the more people I met, and the more people I told about my little business making books, the more doubt I heard from people. I even had a guy working the counter at Barnes & Noble question why I was buying a copy of the unabridged version of the Oxford English Dictionary. "Why would you buy a dictionary? Don't you have the internet?" From the guy working at the bookstore. So I told him, you can't flip the pages of the internet looking for words. You have to know what you want to look up. And he stared at me. "And when the world ends, I can burn this shit to stay warm." He stared at me some more. But I was not deterred. I kept telling more people about my dream of making paper and books that made people happy. And I started having friends old enough to get married and have kids, and I started making their guest books and their invitations and as my gifts to them, because I was broke and I couldn't afford to buy stuff off their registries, and I knew I could make something that they would never forget. And it worked. And people at their weddings saw the things that I'd made, and word started getting around that I was creating some cool stuff. And so I started doing some local craft shows, but my work schedule is not very conducive to building up a large amount of inventory for sale. So each show was a whole production of sleepless nights, making as many things as I possibly could, and then going into work bleary-eyed the next day. And I had a friend offer to help me open up a venue for poetry, music, and art. And I jumped at that chance. That sounded like a great time. We named it Bon Vivant, which is loosely translated as an appreciation for the good things in life. And I needed some furniture for the place. And a friend of mine told me about this guy who owned this building. It was packed full to the gills of furniture, and he would probably be willing to give me some of it if I went and volunteered to help him at this building. So we drove over to see this gigantic old building called Burnwood that was slowly getting fixed up by this guy, Willoughby-Lohr, a.k.a. Burn, hence the Burnwood. And as soon as I saw him, I recognized that he was a guy I'd played a show with years and years ago at a long since closed underground art space that I frequented called Art Brutal. And he was nice enough to accept my offer to sweep the floor as a trade for a bunch of furniture. And I was in business. So now I had a place to foster creation in my community, and I was so excited. And I worked many late nights getting it ready and setting up events, and the creativity was just pouring out of my veins. And we opened on the first day of the Infringement Festival 2008, and we were booked solid for months. At the same time, I had an offer to become a teaching artist and to teach poetry and writing to middle school kids. And I rearranged my work schedule at the gas station to work 4 10-hour days so I could teach on the 5th day and then run shows at my new venue in the evenings. I had a big problem with saying no at this point in my life. And I had stretched myself very, very thin. I was never home. I hardly got more than 4 hours of sleep. And right in the middle of all that, my oldest brother was diagnosed with leukemia. He found out on a Friday, started treatment on Monday. By Wednesday, he was in a medically induced coma because he couldn't breathe without the ventilator. And I was already beyond overscheduled, and all of a sudden I was spending every free second I had in the waiting room at Roswell, waiting to see if he could come out of this coma. And then the city zoning board shut my venue down. You know, the cancer in the bus that was coming to hit me I talked about earlier. It's here. It was here. And something had to give. And that same week, I went to Target to buy new underwear because I never had time to do laundry. And who did I happen to run into? That guy from earlier, Bern, the guy with all the furniture. And you know, when someone says, you know, how are you? And you just give them that like bullshit answer, like, oh, I'm good. Like, even when you're not. This was not one of those times. And I ended up unloading on him, even though he was pretty much a stranger. I just knew him a little bit. And I said, actually everything's shitty. My brother's about to die. I'm working way too much and I have no time to sleep and the city just shut my venue down. Can I possibly move some of these acts over to your venue instead? And he just smiled and said, sure. That's it. And I went over to Burnwood a few days later to set up the first of these relocated shows and fully expected to run the show like I would have at my venue. And I walked in the door and the acts are already there. And they're all set up and sound checked. And Bern walks up and he's like, don't worry, everything's all set. The sound is checked. We've got beers on ice and we're spinning up cotton candy. And just like that, something gave. I'd been focusing so much on creating as much as I could that I hadn't had much time for worthwhile romantic relationships. But at that traveling film festival show at Burnwood, something happened. And I challenged Bern to a game of Scrabble and to be played on a later date when we had more time. And 2 weeks later, my brother died. And I was feeling really lost and searching for something distracting. And I retreated to the darkness and spent my free time on MySpace listening to music by people I knew. When you could do that on MySpace. And then an IM pops up from Bern. Hey, how are you? And again, I unloaded on him. I'm shitty. My brother died last week. I'm not quite sure what to do now. My venue's closed and, I'm just working my job. And other than that, I'm a little lost. And he's like, well, I just got laid off, so I've got lots of free time if you want to hang out. So we made plans to play Scrabble. And he came over one night after I got done working and we played our game. And I won by 4 points. And we talked till 4 a.m. And long story short, he pretty much never left my house again. And within a few weeks, we were creating plans for our future. And when I told him about my paper and book business, he said, oh, that's cool. No judging, no pessimism about the digital future, just support. And he's believed in me ever since. In the next decade, we joined a band together. I got a new job at the jewelry company. We got married. We sold Burnwood. We sold my house to my brother and bought a different building. And this new one had space for us to live and a room to play music together and a space for each of us to have a studio and a space for me to make paper for real. We had our first son in 2015, and shortly after that, I quit my job at the jewelry place to run Papercraft Miracles full time and to stay home with our kids. And we now have 2 little boys, and my studio has grown into a 2-story solar-powered workshop with a fully functional paper-making studio in the basement. All because we took a chance on creating something. We trusted that we could create a life together that would allow both of us to keep creating successfully. And we're about 10 years into our 15-year plan. And things are moving right along in that direction. And the goal is to get to the point where he can quit his job too, so he can also pursue art full-time. And quitting my job to stay home with my kids and run my own business was simultaneously the easiest decision and the hardest transition I have ever had to make, though. I had to adjust my perspective on my business, which had always been my fun side gig, where if I made money, that's cool. If I didn't, I made art, and that's also cool. But now it was my career. I had to get serious about it, and that's where the transition got hard. There was a lot more riding on my art now. The future of my family depended on doing this right and creating a successful business for the rest of my life. And I knew I could do it, but I had to take a step back in order to take a running leap with both feet, if that makes sense. Those first few months where I was learning how to be a mother while learning how to work for myself while being home with the baby were really hard. But I kept creating and I kept asking for help and I kept telling people about my dream. And here we are 2.5 years later and people are finally starting to see that I wasn't crazy to want to make paper all those years ago. I was just ahead of my time. Seeing the future? Maybe. Believing in myself? For sure. a big part of being creative and making things comes from the belief that you can do it. You can do it. And as women, it's ingrained that we doubt ourselves and our abilities, which is really unfortunate. That whole girl power movement of the 90s was awesome for self-esteem, but it didn't touch those structures that were created, all these issues in the first place, all these issues with self-worth. And when we're not apologizing for something, we're worried about how our bodies look or don't look. And when we're not thinking about all that crap, we tend to doubt whether we're able to or if we should create independent lives for ourselves. Don't ask permission to create something for yourself. In the words of Nike, just do it. Being a woman and a business owner requires you to be your own biggest fan, a self-cheerleader, if you will. And the more you believe in your own abilities, the more you'll be able to create. So do it because you can, and not because anybody's going to make you. See you guys later.